The clock tower stands at precisely 10:04, lightning crackling against the night sky. An elderly man with wild white hair sits in a dimly lit room, his eyes still electric blue and alert despite the decades that have passed. Christopher Lloyd's hands, now showing the gentle tremor of age, trace over a faded photograph. Doc Brown hanging from the clock tower, seconds away from disaster. "You know," he says softly, "we never told anyone how close we came that night." The camera pans to reveal weathered stunt diagrams, yellowed production notes, and behind-the-scenes photographs never shared with the public. A collection of newspaper clippings from 1985 shows rave reviews for the film, none mentioning the near catastrophes that occurred just out of frame. A production assistant's journal, opened to a dog-eared page, contains the scribbled note, "CL refused medical attention again today." Said Doc wouldn't complain, so neither would he. At 87, Christopher Lloyd has decided it's finally time to reveal what really happened on those nights when movie magic almost turned tragic. The toll on his body, the close calls that were laughed off in the moment, the brotherhood of silence among a crew who believed great art required great sacrifice. What drove this intensely private actor to guard these secrets for nearly 4 decades? And why reveal them now, when the clock of his own life is ticking forward? At 87, Christopher Lloyd finally told the truth about Back to the Future's most risky scenes. This isn't just about stunts gone wrong, or near misses on a beloved film set. This is the story of how one of cinema's most iconic characters came to life through genuine risk, practical effects in a pre-CGI era, and the silent pact among a film crew to protect each other, and the magic they were creating. In an age when most blockbuster moments are created in air-conditioned computer labs, Lloyd's revelations offer a window into a vanished Hollywood, one where the line between actor and stuntman often blurred, where insurance companies hadn't yet restricted what performers could attempt, and where the physical authenticity on screen came at a genuine physical cost behind it. Today, we'll unpack the moments that could have changed film history, told through the eyes of the man who lived them and kept their secrets for nearly 4 decades. From dangling precipitously from that iconic clock tower to the DeLorean experiments that went frighteningly wrong. These are the stories that have remained in the shadows, while the films themselves stayed in the light of popular culture. The truth behind Doc Brown's wild eyes and frantic energy. Sometimes it wasn't acting at all. Born in 1938 in Stamford, Connecticut, Christopher Allen Lloyd grew up in a world of privilege, but also profound expectation. The youngest of 7 children in a wealthy family that traced its New England roots back to the 1600s, young Christopher found himself drawn not to his father's legal career, but to the transformative power of becoming someone else. His mother, Ruth, a singer and dancer, perhaps planted the first seeds of performance in him, though she never lived to see his greatest successes, passing when he was 19, a loss that friends say instilled in him both a sense of impermanence and a drive to make each performance count. The Lloyd family estate, Waveney Park, sprawled over 300 acres and included a Tudor-style mansion where young Christopher would often disappear for hours, creating elaborate imaginary worlds in its many rooms. Schoolmates from those early years recall a boy who was painfully shy in person, but electrifying when given a character to inhabit. At age 14, Lloyd first stepped onto a summer stock stage and discovered his lifelong passion, though he would later confess it was partly to overcome crippling social anxiety. "I couldn't talk to people as Christopher," he once reflected, "but I could say anything if I was someone else." Quiet and intensely observant, Lloyd developed early the trait that would later define his career and explain his decades of silence about certain filming dangers. A fierce, almost monk-like dedication to his craft that prioritized the work over any personal glory or complaint. This stoicism wasn't performance. It was deeply embedded in his character. At boarding school, he once completed a cross-country race with a sprained ankle, never mentioning the injury until a coach noticed him limping during the award ceremony. This combination, physical courage and emotional reticence, would later enable him to endure filming conditions that other actors might have refused, or at least publicly acknowledged. After years of theater work, including 200 stage productions, Lloyd's breakthrough finally came in 1975. At 37, considerably later than most actors find their footing, he was cast as Reverend Jim Ignatowski in the hit television series Taxi. The role earned him 2 Emmy Awards and established his remarkable ability to embody eccentric characters with both humanity and peculiarity. The Taxi set provided Lloyd's first taste of physical comedy and its associated risks. During one episode, he performed a pratfall that resulted in a hairline fracture in his wrist, an injury he concealed from producers for fear of being replaced. Danny DeVito, his Taxi co-star, later recalled, "Chris would do anything for authenticity. We'd tell him to fake it, use the stunt guy, but he'd just give that little half-smile and say, 'It won't look real.'" But Hollywood remained largely closed to him until one fateful afternoon in 1984, when a script landed on his agent's desk. A science fiction comedy about time travel, a character named Dr. Emmett Brown, and a director named Robert Zemeckis, who insisted Lloyd was the only person who could play the role. The initial meeting nearly didn't happen. Lloyd, comfortable in television and skeptical of film executives, almost declined. His agent, Bobby Thompson, had to personally drive to his modest apartment in Burbank to convince him to read the script. "I sat there while he read it," Thompson remembered years later. His expression never changed until page 72, the clock tower scene. Then he looked up and said, "This could kill somebody." I thought he was refusing the role. Instead, he said, "When do I meet Zemeckis?" Lloyd was reluctant. Television had been comfortable. Film was unpredictable. But that hesitation would soon give way to the role that would define his career and put him in situations more dangerous than anyone watching the finished film could possibly imagine. Between 1985 and 1990, Lloyd would cement himself in film history through the Back to the Future trilogy. But his path there was anything but typical. His earlier work in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975, Star Trek III, The Search for Spock in 1984, and Buckaroo Banzai in 1984 had already shown his chameleonic ability to disappear into roles. What made Lloyd's style unique was his physical commitment, the way he transformed his lanky, 6'1" frame into whatever the character demanded. For Doc Brown, Lloyd drew inspiration from conductor Leopold Stokowski and Albert Einstein, creating the wild-haired scientist's manic energy and distinctive vocal patterns. He spent weeks practicing with electrical equipment in his garage, developing the scientist's familiarity with gadgets and tools. He practiced Doc's wide-eyed expressions in the mirror until the muscles around his eyes ached. His preparation bordered on obsession. He even slept in Doc's clothes for several nights before filming began to make them feel lived in. But what audiences didn't see was Lloyd's absolute dedication to practical effects and realistic reactions, a commitment that would lead him to take risks that today's insurance companies and CGI capabilities would never permit. His philosophy was simple. If Doc Brown was hanging from a clock tower in the script, then Christopher Lloyd needed to feel that genuine terror of height and precarity to make the moment real. This approach extended to smaller moments too. When Doc slices his finger while working on the DeLorean's wiring in the first film, Lloyd insisted on using a trick blade that, while technically safe, still created uncomfortable pressure on his skin. The wincing reaction seen on film came from genuine discomfort. For scenes where Doc was supposed to be exhausted, Lloyd would sometimes run laps around the set until he was genuinely out of breath. "The camera doesn't lie," he would tell concerned crew members. "Your body knows the difference between pretending to be tired and actually being tired." His co-star Michael J. Fox marveled at this commitment. I'd show up, say my lines, hit my marks. But Chris was living in this whole other dimension of performance, Fox recounted in a 2020 interview. There were days I'd find him sitting alone in the DeLorean hours before filming, muttering equations to himself. Not his lines. Actual physics equations he thought Doc would know. Robert Zemeckis, Steven Spielberg, Bob Gale, and Michael J. Fox formed the creative nucleus around which the Back to the Future universe revolved. While Fox has often spoken about his experiences filming the trilogy, Lloyd maintained a respectful distance from the publicity machine. Zemeckis, in particular, shared a special bond with Lloyd. Both perfectionists, both willing to push boundaries for authenticity. Chris never said no. Zemeckis recalled years later. He'd just ask how we could make it safe enough to try. This creative trust between director and actor allowed Lloyd to take calculated risks that others might have refused. The relationship was built on a shared vision of filmmaking as a physical, tangible craft rather than a technical exercise. Meanwhile, special effects coordinator Kevin Pike and stunt coordinator Walter Scott worked tirelessly behind the scenes, often creating complex safety systems that were then deliberately hidden from camera view. We'd spend days figuring out how to make something both safe and invisible, Pike explained in a rare interview. Sometimes we succeeded more at the invisible part than the safety part, I'm sorry to say. The team developed a shorthand. If Lloyd touched his ear during rehearsal, it meant he was genuinely concerned about a stunt's safety, but didn't want to disrupt the set by voicing it publicly. What almost no one realized was how often that subtle gesture occurred during the clock tower sequence. Costume designer Joanna Johnston played an unexpected role in Lloyd's safety. After noticing his reluctance to voice concerns, she built subtle padding into Doc Brown's wardrobe. The eccentric outfits, already bulky and layered, concealed thin, shock-absorbing materials at the elbows, knees, and along the spine. He never mentioned it, but I'd see him touch the padding sometimes before a difficult scene, Johnston recalled. It was our little secret. Bob Gale, who co-wrote the trilogy with Zemeckis, became Lloyd's chief advocate behind the scenes. Sometimes I had to be the one to say, "This is too much, even for Chris," Gale admitted. He'd never complain, so someone had to look out for him. This protective dynamic extended to the editing room, where certain takes that showed too much authentic distress from Lloyd were quietly shelved in favor of ones that maintained the film's adventurous tone. But here's where it gets complicated. This circle of protection sometimes enabled the very risks it sought to minimize. By creating a culture where Lloyd's physical commitment was both admired and accommodated, they inadvertently encouraged him to push his limits even further. The physical toll of the Back to the Future trilogy has never been fully documented. Lloyd, then in his late 40s, was performing in an era before CGI could easily replace dangerous practical effects. The DeLorean scenes required him to be in confined spaces for hours, often with limited ventilation due to lighting requirements. The car itself, modified heavily for filming, had sharp edges that left Lloyd with a constellation of small cuts and bruises that makeup artists covered daily. The hanging clock tower sequence in the original film, shot over 6 grueling nights, left him with back issues that would plague him for years. Set photographs recently made public show Lloyd between takes, sitting with an ice pack pressed against his lower back, still in full costume, still in character, even while in obvious discomfort. The harness system used was primitive by today's standards, essentially mountaineering equipment modified for film use, with pressure points that created significant bruising across Lloyd's torso. There were burns from pyrotechnics that misfired during the flux capacitor close-ups, though Lloyd never complained. The makeup department developed a special cooling gel that they applied between takes, which Lloyd initially refused until a production assistant convinced him that Doc would want his hands functional enough to finish the experiment. The third film's Wild West sequences put him on horseback for weeks, despite having minimal riding experience. During one sequence, Lloyd's horse was spooked by pyrotechnics and nearly threw him. A moment captured on film and actually used in the final cut, with audiences never realizing the terror in Doc's eyes was entirely genuine. Lloyd suffered a minor shoulder separation in the incident, but returned to set the following day. The locomotive scenes in Part 3 proved particularly hazardous. The combination of an actual vintage steam engine, pyrotechnics, and complex timing created multiple near misses. During one take, Lloyd was pulled away from a dangerous area by a quick-thinking crew member just seconds before a steam valve released scalding vapor where he had been standing. When asked about these challenges in interviews over the years, Lloyd would deflect with a scientist's precision. "Doc Brown had it much worse than I did." This stoicism extended to emotional costs as well. Lloyd's intense immersion into character meant he often felt disoriented returning to his regular life after filming, a phenomenon he kept private until his 80s. Friends reported that for weeks after filming wrapped, Lloyd would occasionally respond to questions with Doc Brown's characteristic, "Great Scott," before catching himself. But here's where it gets complicated. This same pressure forged the performance that generations have treasured. The wild energy, the sense of barely contained chaos that makes Doc Brown so beloved, came partly from Lloyd's genuine physical experiences on set. As he later reflected, "Sometimes I wasn't acting afraid. I was afraid." But that's what Doc would have felt too. In a rare 2022 interview, as he approached his 87th birthday, Lloyd finally opened up about the reality behind some of the trilogy's most iconic scenes. The clock tower sequence wasn't just movie magic. It was legitimately dangerous, Lloyd revealed. "I was actually suspended 30 feet up for certain shots. The harness dug into my ribs so badly, they had to ice me down between takes." According to Lloyd, the production team created a partial mock-up of the clock face closer to the ground for some angles. But Zemeckis wanted authenticity for the wide shots. Bob would say, "Chris, we need to see the fear in your eyes." And the only way to get that was to put me up there. The night shoots complicated matters further. The tower was slippery with evening dew. The lighting created harsh shadows that concealed potential hazards, and crew members working the safety lines were fighting their own fatigue at 3 a.m. Lloyd also confirmed a long-standing rumor about the lightning rod scene. The metal rod he held actually conducted a small electrical charge in certain takes to make his reaction authentic. "Nothing dangerous," he clarified, "but enough that when you see Doc's hands shaking, that wasn't all acting." This revelation explains the particularly genuine quality of surprise in that iconic moment. Lloyd was responding to actual stimuli, not just imagining Doc's predicament. Perhaps most surprising was Lloyd's admission about the famous mind-reading helmet Doc wears in the first film. The prop department had wired it with small electric motors to create vibration, but the prototype shorted out during one take, delivering a mild shock to Lloyd's scalp. Rather than stopping the scene, he incorporated the jolt into Doc's reaction, creating one of the film's most memorable moments. "We kept filming because I knew we had something special happening," Lloyd recalled. "Sometimes the accidents create the most authentic moments." The DeLorean itself presented numerous challenges. "That car wasn't built for the kind of treatment we gave it," Lloyd explained. "The gull-wing doors would sometimes drop unexpectedly. I still have a small scar on my forehead from ducking too late." The interior scenes, with smoke and effects created through practical means, sometimes left Lloyd lightheaded from chemical fumes. "We didn't have the sophisticated ventilation systems productions use today," he noted. "Sometimes I was genuinely disoriented when delivering lines," which actually worked for the character. Lloyd's revelations came not as accusations, but as historical context. A veteran actor documenting a vanishing era of filmmaking for posterity. "I'm not saying we were reckless," he emphasized. "Everyone tried their best with the knowledge and technology available then. But compared to today's standards, yes, it was much more physically demanding than people realize." The production reality of the mid-1980s bears little resemblance to today's filmmaking environment. While rumors have circulated for years about reckless endangerment on the Back to the Future set, the truth is more nuanced. Safety protocols existed, but they were rudimentary by modern standards. Insurance requirements were less strict, and actors often performed tasks that would now be handled by specialized stunt performers, or eliminated entirely through computer graphics. When Lloyd climbed the clock tower, he was indeed harnessed, but the margin for error was razor thin. The cables were later removed in post-production through optical effects, a painstaking process that wouldn't be necessary with today's technology. "We never did anything truly reckless," Lloyd explained, "but we definitely pushed right up to the edge of what was safe." The mid-1980s represented a transitional period in special effects. Star Wars had revolutionized what audiences expected from science fiction films, but the CGI revolution was still years away. This created a filmmaking environment that relied heavily on practical effects, miniatures, and optical compositing. For actors like Lloyd, this meant physically interacting with real environments and props, rather than green screens and tennis balls on sticks. Legendary special effects artist Ken Ralston, who worked on the trilogy, provided context. Today, no actor would be anywhere near some of the situations we put Chris in. Not because we were cavalier about safety, but because there's simply no need anymore. Most of those scenes would be shot against a green screen, with the environment added later. The Hollywood stunt community was also structured differently then. The specialization we see today, where performers might focus exclusively on vehicle stunts, wire work, or fight choreography, was less common. This meant actors sometimes filled gaps that would now be covered by specialists. Lloyd, with his background in physical theater, often volunteered for challenges that pushed the boundaries between acting and stunt work. What makes this significant isn't just the physical risk, but Lloyd's decades of silence about it. While other actors might have leveraged such stories for publicity, Lloyd's humility kept him from centering himself in the film's legacy. "The movies were never about me," he stated simply. "They were about this wonderful character, and this story about time and family." Drawing attention to what happened behind the scenes would have distracted from that. Now, if you're wondering why these stories matter decades later, they offer a window into a vanishing era of filmmaking, where what you saw on screen required genuine physical commitment from everyone involved. They also highlight the craftsmanship that created beloved moments before computers could simply generate them. As Lloyd put it, "Every time Doc looks terrified, amazed, or overwhelmed, there's a good chance I was feeling something very similar in that moment." That connection between actor and character. That's something no technology can replicate. The second film in the trilogy marked a turning point for Lloyd's approach to risk on set. During the production of Back to the Future, Part 2 in 1989, a stunt involving the flying DeLorean malfunctioned, dropping the vehicle several feet with Lloyd inside. Though he wasn't seriously injured, the incident shook both Lloyd and the crew. "After that day, I started asking more questions," Lloyd admitted in his recent revelations. "I realized I wasn't just responsible for getting the performance right. I was responsible for getting home safely." The incident occurred during filming of a sequence where Doc pilots the flying DeLorean through the futuristic Hill Valley of 2015. The car, suspended by cables and operated by an off-camera hydraulic system, experienced a partial failure when a hydraulic line burst. The vehicle dropped approximately 4 feet before emergency systems engaged. Lloyd, secured by a basic safety belt rather than a modern harness system, was jarred violently. Production shut down for 24 hours, a costly delay for a major studio film. During that time, Lloyd had a lengthy conversation with Zemeckis about balancing authenticity with practicality. "Bob and I sat in his trailer until sunrise," Lloyd recalled. "We talked about art, responsibility, and where to draw the line. He listened in a way few directors would have. When filming resumed, subtle but significant changes were implemented. A stunt double was used for more scenes, particularly those involving the flying DeLorean. The special effects team developed improved safety measures, including redundant backup systems for any apparatus supporting an actor. And perhaps most importantly, Lloyd began using the ear touch signal more frequently, communicating concerns before attempting potentially hazardous scenes. This newfound caution coincided with the film industry's gradual shift toward more stringent safety standards. High-profile accidents on other productions had begun prompting insurance companies to impose stricter requirements. For the third film, additional precautions were implemented, including a full stunt double for Lloyd in several scenes where, previously, he would have insisted on doing the work himself. And that's when everything changed, not just for Lloyd, but for an entire approach to filmmaking that valued authenticity through physical risk. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that a franchise about altering timelines had itself marked a timeline shift in how Hollywood approached danger on set. There's a scene in Part 3 where Doc faints upon seeing the unfinished railroad bridge, Lloyd noted. In the first film, I probably would have insisted on actually falling to the ground. By the third film, I was comfortable with the camera cutting away and using a padded stunt area for the fall. The audience never knew the difference. This evolution reflected broader industry changes, as CGI began demonstrating its potential to replace physically dangerous stunts. James Cameron's The Abyss and Terminator 2 were showing how digital effects could create previously impossible sequences without risking performers. By the time Back to the Future Part 3 wrapped, Hollywood was on the cusp of a revolution that would forever change the relationship between physical risk and on-screen spectacle. In the decades following Back to the Future, Lloyd continued to build an impressive filmography while bringing a more measured approach to physical performance. His roles in The Addams Family, Dennis the Menace, and Angels in the Outfield showcased his versatility while allowing him to step back from the more physically demanding aspects of his earlier career. On the set of The Addams Family, Lloyd's portrayal of Uncle Fester still required physical commitment, including the famous light bulb and mouth scene. But he worked closely with the special effects team to ensure safety while maintaining the illusion. By then, I had learned to collaborate more openly with effects people, Lloyd explained. Instead of trying to do everything authentically myself, I saw how combining performance with technical solutions often created better results. This evolution became particularly evident in his approach to stunts. For a scene in Dennis the Menace where Switchblade Sam falls from a bridge, Lloyd requested specific changes to the script that would allow for a cleaner handoff to his stunt double. 10 years earlier, I might have tried to convince them to let me do it myself, he admitted. By the 90s, I understood that my value was in the character work, not in taking physical risks. Yet Lloyd never lost his commitment to character immersion. Colleagues from later projects note his remarkable ability to maintain the same intense preparation and character work while advocating more openly for safety. Director Barry Sonnenfeld, who worked with Lloyd on Addams Family Values, observed, "Chris still disappeared into Fester completely, but he was much more pragmatic about the physical aspects. He'd say, 'Let's figure out how to make this look dangerous without actually being dangerous.'" This evolution reflected broader changes in the industry, but also Lloyd's own maturation as an artist. As motion capture technology developed, Lloyd became an early adopter, recognizing that he could provide the essence of a character's movement without subjecting his aging body to unnecessary strain. For the animated film Anastasia, he enthusiastically embraced the motion capture process, finding it liberating rather than limiting. By the time he appeared in Sin City and Star Trek: The Next Generation, Lloyd had become not just a character actor, but a mentor to younger performers, often quietly advising them on how to achieve authentic performances without unnecessary physical risk. "The best acting happens when you're not distracted by wondering if you'll get hurt," he began telling younger cast members. "That's something I had to learn the hard way." This wisdom extended to his teaching work at acting workshops, where he would share, techniques for simulating physical states, exhaustion, pain, fear, without actually experiencing them. The audience doesn't care if you really fell down the stairs or just acted falling down the stairs, became one of his favorite sayings. They only care if they believed it. Lloyd's later career demonstrated how an actor can maintain artistic integrity while adapting to changing personal and industry conditions. In his 70s and 80s, he continued taking roles that challenged him creatively but accommodated his physical limitations, a balance that allowed him to extend his career far longer than many of his contemporaries. As Lloyd's revelations about the Back to the Future set have emerged, it's equally important to understand what these truths don't signify. Lloyd has been explicit that he holds no grudges and harbors no resentment towards Zemeckis, Spielberg, or anyone else involved in the production. "We were making something special, and we all knew it required extraordinary commitment," he explained. "I wouldn't trade those experiences for anything." In fact, Lloyd views the physical challenges of the trilogy as instrumental to his development as an actor. "Those films taught me my limits, both that I could push further than I thought, and that there was a point where pushing further didn't serve the story." This balanced perspective has characterized his recent discussions of the production, acknowledging the genuine risks while celebrating the results they achieved. Lloyd's decision to speak now comes not from bitterness, but from a desire to contribute to film history and to acknowledge the often invisible physical demands placed on actors of his generation. In a media landscape often dominated by superhero blockbusters, where actors train intensively but perform with extensive digital enhancement, Lloyd offers a window into a different kind of physical commitment. One where the hazards weren't part of a publicized training regimen, but simply the unspoken reality of bringing fantastical scenes to life. He's particularly careful to emphasize that the risks taken were collaborative decisions, not impositions. "Nobody forced me to do anything. If anything, I probably pushed harder than I should have." This acknowledgement of his own agency in the process reflects Lloyd's characteristic grace, taking responsibility for his choices while contextualizing them within the filmmaking standards of the time. When asked if he would advise young actors to take similar risks today, Lloyd is unequivocal. "Absolutely not. We have better tools now, better understanding of safety. The risks we took were unnecessary in retrospect. Great performances don't require physical danger." This evolution in his thinking represents not a repudiation of his earlier approach, but a recognition of how the industry has rightfully progressed. Here's the part most people miss. Lloyd's revelations aren't meant to diminish the magic of the films, but rather to deepen our appreciation for the human effort behind them. By sharing these stories, he's not suggesting that modern filmmaking safety protocols have somehow diminished the art form. Instead, he's documenting a transitional period in cinema history, one where practical effects and physical performance were giving way to digital innovation, but hadn't quite made the leap. "When you watch those films now," Lloyd suggested, "know that what you're seeing is a kind of filmmaking that doesn't really exist anymore. Not because we've lost something, but because we've found better ways to tell stories without putting people at risk." Throughout his career, Christopher Lloyd has maintained a distinctly private life, despite his public persona. Married 5 times but rarely discussing his relationships in interviews, Lloyd has always drawn a clear boundary between his work and personal worlds. Friends describe him as deeply introverted, someone who can transform completely on camera, but who values solitude when not performing. This reticence extends to his charitable work with the Lillian Booth Actors Home and his advocacy for Parkinson's research, efforts he conducts quietly, without publicity. Lloyd has donated substantial time and resources to supporting retired actors facing financial or health challenges, a commitment shaped by his own observations of how quickly the industry can forget its veterans. Friends describe a man who finds solitude rejuvenating and who enjoys photography, hiking, and cycling when not on set. His Stamford, Connecticut home features an extensive collection of astronomy books and equipment, an interest that predated his role as Doc Brown, but deepened through his research for the character. These grounding activities have helped him maintain perspective throughout a career spanning over 5 decades. Lloyd's longtime friend and occasional director Cameron McIntosh noted, "Chris can go weeks barely speaking to anyone, then step onto a set and become the most expressive person in the room. It's like he saves all his energy for the performance." This conservation of social energy may explain how Lloyd has maintained his creative vitality well into his 80s, while many of his contemporaries have retired or reduced their workloads. Despite his private nature, Lloyd has developed meaningful relationships with fans, particularly those who grew up with Back to the Future. At conventions and public appearances, staff have observed his remarkable patience with people who share how Doc Brown influenced their interest in science or inspired them during difficult times. Though these interactions clearly tax his introverted nature, Lloyd seems to recognize them as part of the covenant between performer and audience. Lloyd's decision to finally discuss the physical challenges of his most famous role comes from a place of reflection rather than attention-seeking. At 87, he views these stories as part of a legacy that belongs not just to him, but to film history and to the generations who have found meaning in Doc Brown's adventures. At some point, he reflected, keeping these stories to myself started to feel selfish. They're not just my experiences. They're part of something much bigger that belongs to everyone who loves these films. This shift toward greater openness coincides with Lloyd's broader acceptance of his place in pop culture history. After decades of sometimes seeming uncomfortable with Doc Brown's overshadowing of his other work, Lloyd has made peace with the character's significance. Now, if you're wondering why this matters, it's because this acceptance has allowed him to finally share the complete story, both triumphant and challenging, of bringing Doc Brown to life. Christopher Lloyd's influence extends far beyond the Back to the Future trilogy. His portrayal of Doc Brown has influenced countless eccentric scientist characters in film and television, from Rick Sanchez in Rick and Morty to Tony Shalhoub's Adrian Monk. The wild-haired, wide-eyed, intensely passionate archetype that Lloyd perfected has become a template for characters who are brilliant but socially unconventional. Beyond the specific character, Lloyd's physical approach to performance, the way he uses his entire body to convey emotion and personality, has influenced performers like Jim Carrey, Johnny Depp, and more recently, Cillian Murphy, who cited Lloyd as an inspiration for his character in Oppenheimer. "What I took from Lloyd was his ability to show thought physically," Murphy explained in a 2023 interview. "You can literally see his characters thinking." Lloyd's career exemplifies the value of character actors who may never receive top billing, but who elevate every project they join. His filmography demonstrates remarkable range, from the menacing Klingon Commander Krug in Star Trek III to the lovable professor in Honey, I Shrunk the Kids to the cartoon come-to-life Judge Doom in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Each performance is distinct, yet carries Lloyd's signature commitment to physical transformation. Film schools now regularly use Lloyd's performances as teaching examples, particularly when instructing actors on how to convey complex emotions through body language rather than dialogue. His work demonstrates how a raised eyebrow or a specific posture can communicate volumes, a skill particularly valuable in science fiction and fantasy genres, where characters often need to react convincingly to imaginary elements. Directors who have worked with Lloyd consistently praise his preparedness and precision. Ron Howard, who directed him in Gung Ho, noted, "Chris comes to set having made hundreds of small decisions about his character that most actors wouldn't even consider. Every gesture has purpose. This attention to detail has influenced a generation of character actors who understand that memorable performances often come from these accumulated small choices rather than grand dramatic moments." His willingness to now share the physical realities behind his most famous role adds another dimension to his legacy. highlighting the often invisible labor that creates movie magic. Young filmmakers studying these revelations gain insight into both what to emulate and what to avoid from Lloyd's experiences. But here's where it gets complicated. Lloyd's revelations about risk don't diminish the film's impact, but rather enhance our understanding of the human commitment behind them, especially in an era when CGI has replaced much of what once required physical courage from performers. As actor Simon Pegg reflected after hearing Lloyd's stories, knowing what he went through doesn't make those moments less magical. It makes them more so. There's something powerful about realizing a human being was really up there, really afraid, really creating that moment from genuine experience. Was Christopher Lloyd ever actually in danger during filming? Yes and no. While safety measures existed, they were minimal by today's standards. The clock tower scene involved actual heights with safety equipment that would be considered inadequate in modern productions. The DeLorean scenes included real pyrotechnics with minimal shielding. However, the production never intentionally endangered him. The risks came from the limitations of 1980s safety technology and the practical effects approach necessary before CG. I was advanced enough to create convincing alternatives. Why did Lloyd stay silent about these challenges for so long? Lloyd's generation of actors typically didn't discuss on-set difficulties publicly. Complaining was seen as unprofessional, and there was a code of protecting the movie magic from too much behind-the-scenes exposure. Lloyd, in particular, was concerned that talking about the physical reality might diminish audiences' enjoyment of the films. As he recently explained, people don't want to think about an actor being uncomfortable while they're enjoying the story. Additionally, Lloyd's naturally private personality made him reluctant to center himself in discussions about films he views as collaborative achievements. Has this changed how Lloyd views the films? Not negatively. In fact, he expresses pride in the physical commitment that made the performances authentic, while acknowledging that today's safety standards are necessary improvements. I look at those films and see moments where genuine fear or exhaustion created something special, he reflected. I wouldn't change that, but I'm glad actors today don't have to make the same trade-offs. Lloyd sees the evolution of filmmaking technology as progress rather than loss. Does Lloyd regret any of the risks he took? The only regret he's expressed relates to long-term physical effects. There are days when my back reminds me of that clock tower, he admitted in a recent interview. But then I meet someone who named their child after Doc Brown, or became a scientist because of those films, and any regret disappears. He has been clear that while he wouldn't recommend today's actors take similar risks, he values what those experiences contributed to his performances. Are these revelations changing how fans see the movies? Most report an increased appreciation for the practical effects and performances, knowing the genuine effort behind scenes they've loved for decades. Film historians and preservationists have also noted the value of these accounts in documenting a transitional period in cinema history. The last era before CGI fundamentally changed how movies are made. Now, if you're wondering whether other actors from that era have similar stories, almost certainly yes. Lloyd's willingness to share his experiences may open the door for others to acknowledge the physical reality behind beloved films of the pre-CGI era. Several stunt performers from the 1980s have already come forward with their own accounts after hearing Lloyd's revelations, creating a more complete picture of filmmaking during this pivotal period. Time has given Christopher Lloyd a unique vantage point on his career and the risks that shaped it. At 87, he can trace the arc from a young actor willing to do almost anything for authenticity to a veteran performer who values safety alongside craft. This journey mirrors the evolution of filmmaking itself, from an era where practical effects necessitated physical commitment to today's digital landscape, where the most spectacular moments often happen inside a computer. The irony isn't lost on me, Lloyd reflected recently, that I played a character obsessed with the dangers of altering the timeline. while the timeline of filmmaking itself was changing around us. The Back to the Future trilogy sits at a technological inflection point, the last major science fiction franchise before CGI revolutionized special effects. This timing means the films capture a vanishing approach to movie magic, one that required human ingenuity and physical courage rather than processing power. Lloyd doesn't regret the risks he took to bring Doc Brown to life. He considers them a necessary part of the character's authenticity. The manic energy, the wide-eyed wonder, the frantic movements, all were enhanced by Lloyd's genuine physical experiences on set. But he appreciates that today's performers can achieve similar results without the same physical toll. An actor shouldn't have to hurt themselves to create a convincing performance, he noted. That was something we accepted then that we shouldn't accept now. This perspective has been shaped by Lloyd's experiences mentoring young actors, many of whom express amazement at the conditions he worked under. "They look at me like I'm describing ancient history," he said with a chuckle. "And I suppose I am." This generational difference highlights how quickly filmmaking standards have evolved. What was common practice in 1985 now seems almost recklessly archaic. The clock tower still stands on the Universal Studios lot, a testament to both movie magic and the very real efforts behind it. For Lloyd, that image has come to represent both the exhilarating heights of his career and a reminder of what was once required to reach them. Tourists who visit the location and take photographs rarely realize that the actor they admire was actually suspended from that structure, with far less protection than any performer would have today. And that's when everything changed. Not in a single moment, but in the slow recognition that revealing these truths doesn't diminish the magic, but rather honors the human effort behind it. Lloyd's decision to share these stories now, in the twilight of his remarkable career, adds depth to a beloved cultural touchstone without tarnishing its legacy. If anything, knowing the reality behind Doc Brown's wild-eyed panic makes the performance more impressive, not less. In the end, Lloyd reflected, what matters isn't how we made the films, but what they mean to people. If Doc and Marty inspired someone, made them laugh, or got them through a tough time, that's what counts. The rest is just process. This generous perspective, prioritizing audience experience over personal recognition, perhaps explains both why Lloyd kept these stories private for so long and why he now feels comfortable sharing them. As twilight falls on Christopher Lloyd's remarkable career, his decision to finally share these stories feels like one last gift to the generations who grew up believing a DeLorean could fly if it hit 88 miles per hour. There's a dignity in his timing, waiting until he had the perspective of nearly 9 decades of life to contextualize those moments of physical risk and fear. His revelations invite us to see these beloved films with new eyes, to recognize that behind every iconic moment was a group of dedicated artists using the tools available to them, sometimes pushing boundaries of safety to create something that would endure. The lightning strike, the hoverboard chase, the clock tower rescue, all were created through a combination of practical ingenuity and human commitment that today's digital tools have largely rendered unnecessary. In sharing these experiences now, Lloyd bridges 2 eras of filmmaking, honoring what was valuable in the hands-on approach of the past, while acknowledging the benefits of today's safer methods. This isn't nostalgia for unnecessary risk, but rather a documentation of transition, a first-hand account of cinema's evolution from one technological age to another. Perhaps that's the final lesson from the man who taught us all about the space-time continuum. Some truths can only be fully understood when enough time has passed. In the warm glow of memory, even the most precarious moments on that clock tower set have transformed into something precious. Testaments to a time when movie magic required not just imagination, but courage. As Lloyd himself put it in our final conversation, with that familiar twinkle still bright in his eyes, "We didn't know we were making something that would last for generations. We were just trying to tell a good story as best we could, with whatever we had available." He paused, then added with Doc Brown's characteristic half-smile, "Great Scott, indeed."